Bryan, here we are. We're in Auckland at the university, and we're going to talk about you. Where do we start?
Well, who knows where we start?
Sure. Can we talk?
What do you want to know?
Well, can we talk about music? Your first experiences with music. Were your parents interested in music?
Yes, that's a good beginning. My mother she was into the arts, and this was in Hastings. And we went to everything with my sister and I, with my mother, to the Hastings Municipal Theatre. I don't know whether you know it. But we weren't well off, so we booked tickets on what we called the Gods up there. And we had to run up many flights of stairs. You couldn't book, but we went early to get the front seats. And we heard and saw almost everything that was on, from the Vienna Boys Choir to Oklahoma, to Kim Borg, to Marian Anderson, to Spanish dance troupes, all that sort of thing, which for me was quite natural. My father, no, dear Dad, he was a motor mechanic. And to this day, I regret not ever asking him about his skills and profession, and he never offered. So I can barely lift the bonnet of a car, let alone do anything else, but he could do everything. He could plumb, do electrical work, paint, build, and so on. So they were very different. And again, going back to my father, on my 21st birthday, he gave me a very nice watch because he said, "We haven't had a close relationship, and I want to give you something. But you know, Mark, the thing that I value most of all was that there was never a word of doubt or criticism, or you should or you shouldn't, or whatever, throughout my life. I was allowed to be exactly who I was, whether he understood it or not." But anyway, dear mother, she paid for our piano lessons. She took us to concerts. She got us a piano. She upgraded the piano when that was necessary. And she found my sister and I the best teachers. So my piano teacher, principal piano teacher in those early days, was Eunice Clayton. And you will understand this. She was one of 4 unmarried sisters. There were those around in those days. One was a Plunkett nurse, one was a scout mistress, another was a piano teacher. And dear Eunice had espoused the Rudolf Steiner principles. So she taught at the Rudolf Steiner schools around Hastings and Havelock North, where she lived. And she called at our house by car twice a week in the evenings to give my sister and I piano lessons. She was vegetarian, of course, and I didn't know anything about vegetarianism in those days. She was an anthroposophical adherent. Her sister introduced me to Krishnamurti and things of that kind, none of which, of course, was popular at the time. But Eunice, bless her, somehow or another in those pre-computer days was very well educated and very well read. I inherited all her books and music when she died, and there were things like the testimony of Shostakovich and Robert Kraft talking to Stravinsky and so on. Where she found all these things, I have no idea. And she knew about exams and competitions, and also that there was to be a practical music school opened at Auckland University in the year that I came. She knew these things. I don't know how. She also took us to Wellington on 2 or 3 occasions to hear special people play, like Julius Catcham. She heard that there was a Brahms recital of Julius Catcham in Wellington, so off we went to hear it. I came to the Auckland competitions, and everybody in Hastings said, "Oh, the standard is so high, you see." Well, I did quite well, and so I thought, okay, Hastings isn't so bad after all. And you know, Mark, that has influenced my entire life, because not just in Hastings do people say, oh, the standard is so high elsewhere. They say that about countries outside New Zealand. Well, pardon me for saying so, but give me a good Kiwi any day and they will prosper. Whether more or whether less, I don't know, but certainly they're not overcome by circumstances abroad, and that's been my experience all my life. I could say unkindly that sometimes in Europe I'm asked where I come from, and they say, but how do you know that this is on when you only come from New Zealand? And I said, that's because I come from New Zealand, I know these things. We have to look out. There's nowhere else to look. We have to look up and out. So we do the research, and when I first went to the Aotearoa in Austria, that was as a result of Janetta McStay's recommendation. And I have long-standing Parisian friends. And so I said to Bernard, you must come to the Aotearoa with me after you retire, because he'd never been away without his wife.
Yes.
And I said, I will ask Madeleine if she will release you to go to the Aotearoa with me, because he was particularly interested. So we went by train from Paris. And when we got to the border, the Swiss border, before you go into Austria, he said, it's up to you now, Brian. I don't speak any German apart from the lyrics of Wagner operas. I said, they're not going to do you much good here. So we went to Hittisau, to a delightful family-run guest house, which Janetta had also recommended. And I'd been there before, and I knew that he would be surprised. The standards are remarkable. And this lovely family greeted us. They had a French-speaking receptionist at the top of the stairs. We went down to dinner that night, and Bernard had a little motif in French, and I had a little one in English on our menus. Mine, I remember, was, you only have one chance to make a first impression. And then we had this beautiful meal. I don't remember it all, but I remember the first course was smoked duck's breast with fresh asparagus from the kitchen garden. And he looked at this and said, oh, it's as good as meals in Paris. I said, it's a good deal better than the meals I've had in Paris. So he said, how much are we paying for it? And I said, the dinner, bed and breakfast cost in those days there is 70 euros. Oh, he said, you've got that wrong. The meal must be 70 euros. No, I said, we're not in Paris now, we're in the rest of the world. This is German-speaking Austria, and they do things differently from Paris. So he, living within almost walking distance of the place, had never experienced these things.
And you coming from...
me who introduced him.
Boy from Hastings.
Boy from Hastings. And that's my point.
Yes.
Really.
Yes.
Why it is that he hadn't found out, I don't know, but that's symptomatic of so many things. In the dining room of that beautiful establishment, there were other people dining on another evening, and this was on a separate occasion when Madeleine, his wife, came too, because he said she would love the sheets there. And the sheets are beautiful, but so is other things.
Yes.
Anyway, Madeleine was French and Bernard and I were speaking English, and I was doing the ordering of the meal in German, such as my German is, which is nothing startling. And a man came over and he said, who are you? And I said, what do you mean? He said, where do you come from? He said, you speak Oxford English. you seem to be able to speak French and German, so you're English. And I said, no, I come from New Zealand. Oh, he said, you can't come from New Zealand. You wouldn't speak languages there. And I said, well, we do and we don't. We learn them and then we go elsewhere and thrive on them. But that, again, is very typical. You couldn't possibly come from New Zealand if you speak 3 languages. Well, some of us do. And most of my friends over the years, the Janettas, the Judiths, the Morrises, and so on, have been remarkable people and could hold their own anywhere. I mean, Janetta, for example, was the favourite pianist of the Broadening quartet when they played the Shostakovich quintet with her. They said they'd played it with Richter and Gilels and so on, but not like that, they said. And then Ricci took her to Japan and Australia to play violin and piano recitals and so on. A New Zealander from Southland. Anyway, I get off the track, going back to my youth.
Let's actually go. You've arrived at Auckland University and you're studying with Janetta next day.
No, she wasn't here then.
Okay.
This was 1962. She came in 63.
Right.
And there were teachers on the North Shore and Auckland and Central and so on. So I lived with Owen Burton, who had studied at the Royal College with Phyllis Salick and Cyril Smith. A remarkable woman who, every time I touched the piano, went, oh! Oh! So at the end of the year...
Not a great characteristic for a piano teacher.
Well, all her students will tell you that.
Yes.
Yes, Susan Smith is another.
Yes.
And she tells the story of how she went to play and then withdrew her hands, but still got the ooh. And she said, well, I didn't do anything that time. Oh, and Owen says, yes, but you would have, you see. So anyway, I realised that despite the best efforts of my wonderful Enos Clayton, I was a bit behind the times with approaches to the piano,
yes,
and this and that and the other. So I buckled down and learnt, whereas a lot of students left Auckland and said, oh, we're not putting up with all of that. And I thought, how silly. If somebody is telling you something, it's not to pass the time. It's because they have something to say which they think you need to hear. And even if it's, oh! I thought, what am I doing? Not using my arm or not supporting my
yes,
fingers or whatever. And so I had to work at my 5th finger to get it to go up and down independently of 4 and to have a knuckle support, yes, and all that, yes, sort of thing, which all my students need today. But I don't quite treat them like Owen. Anyway, I had a year with her. And then Janetta came in 63 and I was with her, as was Christine Cumming. We were her first students. And she's on record as saying, quite unnecessarily, I was somewhat afraid of these bright students and my lack of experience with them, but it wasn't a lack of experience, it was just her first students.
Yes.
And off she went.
Yes.
Remarkably. So throughout my life, I've had remarkable teachers. First of all, thanks to my mother. Secondly, thanks to my teacher. And then Janetta recommended my next teacher at the Royal College of Music, Eric Harrison, who wasn't a household name, but somehow she knew that he was the right person for me, and he was. Quite remarkable. I've never met anybody like Eric who spoke a lot about how music moved, and he moved around the room, and he would find the upbeats and the up bars and all that kind of thing. And then when we were playing a concerto, he would sit at the second piano and improvise the orchestral part. Improvise the orchestral part, because he knew it. He didn't need the music. he was the greatest improviser I've ever heard in that way. And then, because this was London, there were many opportunities to hear pianists and all the other music that I explored. And I heard Vladimir, who is known as Polish, but is actually was Lithuanian, Polish Jewish Lithuanian who shifted to France. And being a Kiwi, I didn't think anything of it. I went backstage and said to him, if I came to Paris, would you teach me? He was the leading teacher in Paris at the time, and I had the cheek to ask him if he would teach me. Well, he must have thought of something, because he said, here's my address. Should you come, just look me up and we will hear you. So I did. I went to Paris, to the Royal Opera, and played for him. And interestingly enough, I played Forêt, which was another unusual circumstance. Eric Harrison said to me one day, Nadia Boulanger is giving a masterclass in Forêt in 2 weeks' time, and I want you to play the last nocturne. 2 weeks, I said. Yes. And he said, I'm not going to teach it to you. This is up to you. You'll be able to do it. Well, I never played any Forêt, and the 11th nocturne is about, 13th nocturne rather, is about 11 pages long. Late Forêt, it was 113 or 19 or something like that. Therefore, not straightforward harmonically or contrapuntally or any other way. So I got it out, spent as many hours of the day as was possible to learn this nocturne, and I was having so-called theory lessons at the time with one of her ex-students, a man called John Lambert. And I said to John, what do I have to do to prepare for Nadia Boulanger, this Forêt? And he said, you have to know it back to front, upside down and inside out, because she will know whether you do or whether you don't. So I had to memorize it, of course, and learn it, and memorize it in 14 days. Anyway, until you do those things, you don't know whether you can. So I played it to her, and this is not a boast, this is just an outcome. She said, you could have written that piece.
My goodness, Bryan.
And I could have, because that's how well I knew it.
Bryan, that's just an incredible thing that you just said.
Well, I realise now, but at the time I thought I deserved it, because I really could pick it up anywhere and play this. Or, mind you, she didn't ask the kinds of things she asked at her Parisian Bach classes, which, for example, Daniel Barenboim speaks about.
Yes.
He said he was 11 when he went there, and she said, who's next? He put up his hand, and so he went to play his Brilliant Fugue, and she said, sing the alto and play the other three voices. Oh, he said, what fun! And did so. Well, I wasn't at that level, Mark, don't misunderstand me, but at
sort of
the
relieved.
same time, somehow I must have been ready enough to do sufficiently well for her, and that set me on the path to further looking at composers like Forêt, and I knew that Pianist was a lifelong friend of Forêt. He had in fact played the theme and variations for his graduation recital at the Paris Conservatoire. So I learned the theme and variations with him and other Forêt works, and then of course he had studied all the music of Ravel with Ravel. So I did Ravel with him as well, because when I went to Rouen and played the nocturne, he said, "What do you want me to teach you?" And I said, "Everything." He said, "You don't need everything. You have your own way, which I would want to change, so we will have to follow your course." I said, "All right, I want to look at Fauré, I want to look at Ravel, and I want to look at Chopin," because he was also a great Chopin player. And boy from Hastings, studying with somebody who learned with Ravel, it didn't occur to me that it was unusual, but you have to want these things.
Yes.
And somehow you have to seek them out. And they will happen, whether you're from Hastings or not. So I had this wonderful time in Paris and needed to be well accommodated there. Well, that was trickier.
Trickier than learning the Fauré.
Trickier than finding time with Boulanger and
Yes.
Permuter.
Yes.
Just finding the right accommodation.
That's right.
Anyway, I was friendly with Jeanette and Bevan Fitzsimons. Jeanette, who was the leader of the Green Party here for a long while, and her husband, Bevan, was a banker, and they were in Geneva. So I went one Christmas to stay with them in Geneva and mentioned that I really was looking for somebody to stay in Paris. And through his connections, banking connections, he knew people who knew people who knew people. And one of them knew an expatriate New Zealand pianist living outside Paris, somebody people don't know enough about, Vera Moore. And Vera Moore knew a woman who was the widow of a very wealthy French businessman who loved the piano, had a big apartment quite close to where Permuter lived, and offered me accommodation there with 2 Pleyel grand pianos. Through Vera Moore. Again, I mean, okay, great luck, but not just luck somehow. So I went there. She didn't speak any English, so fortunately I could speak French. And she insisted, because I was English, to make porridge for me in the morning, which was absolutely ghastly because she burnt it all. But anyway, she would sit at the breakfast table and speak about what I thought was vrai amour. She was actually saying their amour. But they were very similar to my ears, and so I had to turn the conversation away from vrai amour. But eventually, she took me in her little Fiat, or whatever it was, out to meet Vera Moore in a little village called Jouy-en-Josas. And Vera Moore played me the Ravel Miroir. Remarkably, just wonderful.
And where was she from in New Zealand?
Good question, not sure. I think Wellington. And what took her there, I don't know. And I don't think I'm spilling any secrets here. She became the mistress of the Italian sculptor called Brancusi. So she had one of those expanded lives that didn't involve, in the end, New Zealand at all. She didn't come back. She didn't, I think, even visit. And I was probably one of the few Kiwi connections she had. But
Did you play for her?
Yes, but not as a student.
No.
I played Fauré to her.
Yes.
And she said to me, "How lucky you are to play Fauré." And I said, "It's not luck." Well, it began luckily,
Yes.
but of course the work involved
Yes.
was not luck.
Yes. Yes.
And I gathered from that she had wanted to play Fauré but hadn't got round to it.
Okay.
Permuter said to me, you must come back to New Zealand and introduce them to Jorge, because he's one of the least known composers. So I kind of did. Well, I came back to New Zealand and I gave a lecture on Jorge's piano writing. I'm not sure how, but I did so, and played nocturnes, including the last one, and the theme and variations, and then looked at the chamber music, which is simply wonderful. And the song cycles, and met up with a woman who had studied in Paris with Pierre Bernard. So she had studied Poulenc and Fauré and Debussy and Milhaud, and we did all those song cycles, because in those days Radio New Zealand used to record things.
Yes.
Those days.
Those days, weren't they great days?
Absolutely. We would go to the studio and record things.
Yes.
In Durham Street.
Yes. You're talking down in Christchurch?
No, here.
Oh, because the reason why I say that is that Radio New Zealand had their studios in Durham Street at one stage in Christchurch too. Yes. Okay.
So that was also an extension of the French connection. And people say, why French music? And the answer to that I really can't give you, except that, of course, I looked at Debussy with Inez Clayton and loved it. Oh, and then there was the situation at Hastings Boys High School. We could choose either music or French as the subject. And without elaborating, the music wasn't really what I would call worthwhile. So I chose French.
Yes.
So I probably became the only ex-Hastings Boys High School student who didn't take a single music lesson at school who became a professional musician. But I chose French.
Yes.
And went on with that at Auckland University.
Yes.
So it was both music, French and English at Auckland.
Yes.
So I did a BA as well. And I just somehow knew that I would use it. And less and less now, of course, it gets rusty as the years go by, but I still love going back to Paris and dealing with French. And I just wish I had other languages too, because I think they open up the world.
It's never too late. Bryan, Bryan, when did you start teaching?
Well, I was in Paris when I got a call from Charles Norton, the then head of the music school at Auckland University, to say that Janetta was asking for an assistant at the university, and would I consider coming back to be her assistant? Well, you don't say no to that, even if you're in Paris.
Yes.
And learning with Pelmitier and all that sort of thing. So I came back in 1970 and joined Janetta. And again, in those days, we could do things like this. We taught the same students. And so I was asked to teach. For example, we had scale exams, so I did the scales and arpeggios and all that sort of thing. But also, she seemed to have faith in my teaching of Bach, so I taught all the Bach. Well, there's a lot of Bach to teach Bach.
Yes.
And so in my first summer holidays, I had 18 suites and 48 preludes and fugues and 6 toccatas and 26 symphonies and inventions to go through and make sure that I had some idea of the whole repertoire, not just what I had learned.
That sounds like a wonderful holiday.
Well, it was.
It must have
also
been.
a wonderful opportunity.
Yes.
So in the course of, how long was I at Auckland University? 34 years. I taught almost all of that, 47 preludes and fugues. And you might ask why I didn't teach the 48th. It's a kind of principle. I no longer believe in 100%. I think that nobody's 100%. And so I stopped at 99. Just more or less as it happened.
Yes.
And I really believe that nothing is 100%. If it's 100%, there's nothing more to do.
Yes, yes.
And so she and I taught together very happily for as long as she was at Auckland, until 1982, which is 12 years, when I arranged a tribute concert to her from her former students. And she and I did quite a lot of playing together, both two pianos and particularly duets. So we had played all the French duets, of course, and we had also played the wonderful Schubert F minor Fantasy. So she and I played that at her final concert. Peter Godfrey did the speaking, and Ingrid Warburg, Christine and I played pieces. I in fact played Ravel, Vas Noble Sentimental, which you never hear people play, which I absolutely love. So after that, I was joined by Thomas Vesmas, who came from Paris, in fact, Romanian but French citizen. And he was with me, not teaching the staging, we had our own classes.
Yes.
Then, but also happy colleagues until I left in 2004, when I was 60. And I remember saying to the head of the music school then that I was retiring the following year, and he said, "But you can't." And I said, "Well, I am." So what are you going to do? Well, the piano exams had always taken place in October, November, the time that the rhododendrons came out in Taranaki. And I said, "Well, I'm going to the Rhododendron Festival in Taranaki for one thing." He said, "You can't leave us to do that." And I said, "Well, watch me." All the things that were being put aside because of the university curriculum and year, I could only ever go to Europe in the winter time, because that was when we were free. So I did leave, but I knew that universities moved very slowly in these ways, that they wouldn't find a replacement, and I didn't want the students to be stranded. So I asked Michael Houston if he would come and teach my students in the year that I had first left, which he did, just for a year. And then Thomas came, and they appointed other pianists little by little over the years. So I went off around the world to do curious things again. I wanted to hear the ring cycle again, having heard it first as a student in London where Schulte was conducting. And my German isn't so great that I can survive German subtitles for the ring cycle, so I went to Chicago with English subtitles. Again, don't ask me why I chose Chicago, but it was the right choice. I've been back to the Lyric Theatre in Chicago many times, and I love it. Their ring cycle was phenomenal, conducted by Andrew Davis with their wonderful orchestra. Marvelous cast. It included people like Placido Domingo and so on. It was just remarkable. But being in America, they had a way of staging it which was not Hollywood, but owed a great deal to technology. There's a dragon in Siegfried which started at the back of the stage and moved forward until it occupied the whole stage. How they do things like that, I don't know. Brunhilde's immolation was, the whole theatre was on fire. It was breathtaking. And I've been back to Chicago to see other operas that you wouldn't normally see. I saw my first Gluck there, Orfeo and Eurydice, which was done in silhouette, black and white. I saw Rusalka with René Fleming, Dvorak opera. I saw Clemente di Tito with Joyce Di Donato. And because I'm a subscriber, which I'm not really, but they're very loyal. They
Yes.
somehow, if you go, they keep you informed.
Yes.
I was invited to a special subscribers concert of Fleming and Jonas Kaufmann with the orchestra. And of course I went back to Chicago for that. So these things all started in 2004 when I left the university and went out to see the real world.
And of course, you're very busy with your private studio.
Yes, absolutely. I wouldn't have expected to be, but there is a great clamour for lessons from young Asian students and all.
Yes.
If I was looking for Kiwis, forget it. They're not there. Don't know what they're doing.
Yes, they say that music schools around the world would close down.
Yes,
If they...
this would close down.
Yes.
So I have, my youngest is 11. I won't teach much before then. And he's a boy who doesn't have big hands, and that's a problem because he said to me, I want to play some Brahms. And I said, Brahms? Why? Thinking that he wouldn't know anything about it. And he said, because it's so beautiful. Well, I said, you might have to wait until your hands are big enough because Brahms requires many octaves. Well, he said, that would disappoint me. So we found some Brahms where we could manage by leaving out the odd thumb and so on.
Yes.
But how does he know these things? Where does that come from? And most of them are quite knowledgeable, very serious about their work, charming, quick, and I have one exceptional student who really dictates her own learning. She says that her favourite composer is Bach. Well, that suited me, but what I wasn't expecting was that she's working her way through the 48. She's now at F sharp in book 2, so she hasn't far to go.
Will you let her finish?
Yes, of course. It's her life, not mine. And so...
That is a wonderful teacher comment you've just made, Brian. It's her life, not mine, yes.
She influences me as much as I her, and they all do in their way.
Yes.
I've got another boy who really doesn't play the piano much at all, but he's a talker about this, that and the other, including the life of bees and so on. If his mother was listening to this, she wouldn't be very pleased, but she doesn't quite know who I'm talking about. But he needs to talk about the things that interest him with somebody who's interested in him. And I suspect that that doesn't happen in his life. So when I said to him, you know, you don't have to have a weekly lesson, you could come fortnightly, which would take the pressure off. He said, this is the one lesson I want to come to. And it's hardly a piano lesson. So there's many different reasons to teach the piano. And this girl playing Bach, she chooses quite a lot of her repertoire. One day she came and said she wanted to play the Dutier Sonata. Well, I didn't know that. I only met Dutier through the cello piece with orchestra and that sort of thing. And so I said, why? What is it about Dutier that appeals to you? And she said, I've never heard anything quite like this before, and it has a chorale and variations for third movement. And when she plays that in ordinary circumstances for scholarships or competitions, of course, she impresses the hell out of people because A, it's the kind of music it is, and B, the kind of music she plays. She's just won the National Concerto Competition playing Rachmaninoff, Rhapsody on a Theme of Paganini. She's 15. But she's not 15.
No.
And it's a great pleasure to be helping somebody like that because you can go much further than you imagine. There is no end to it. There really is no end to it. And I say to the students, you see, I'll be 80 next year. It's not a happy age in many ways, except I wouldn't want to be less experienced by a year than I am now, because I'm a slow learner. I'm still learning.
On that note, Bryan, I think we should start. That was just such a wonderful interview, and I wish I had been a student of yours.
Well, you were a student of other great people, Mark, so you didn't miss out.
Thank you, Bryan.